Hi, Lester, Wushu engineer. A few years ago, the Wushu scientist and I were invited to participate in a health and fitness expo that was held in Toowoomba, Queensland, for emergency services personnel. We were asked to put on a bit of a demonstration for the attendees. Demonstrations are often instances where true traditional Kung Fu or Wushu can be a bit lacking and perhaps a bit boring because it's not really structured as a performance art. We don't perform any of the showy, though incredibly demanding, acrobatic feats that modern performance-based Wushu is full of. Which is a good thing, because I do not consider myself an acrobat. I've never intentionally performed the backflip. However, we said yes to the request. On the day, there was a small crowd of emergency services personnel in attendance, many of whom were big police officers, fire services members, and ambulance crew members. Many of these good folk are diligent practitioners of some form of martial art. In many cases, because the job demands that they intervene physically with potentially violent people. After running our small information booth for a couple of hours and meeting and greeting a few folk, we went up on stage and performed some of our forms to lukewarm reception. I then decided to mix things up a little bit. I wanted to demonstrate some of the advanced biomechanics that form part of our system. So I asked for a volunteer from the crowd. To be honest, I actually expected to have to choose from a crowd of people all wanting to be the first to teach the upstart Kung Fu practitioner a lesson. For those who aren't aware, Kung Fu has a bit of an unfortunate but not entirely deserved bad reputation these days in terms of its real world effectiveness. And yet, not one burly soul would raise their hand to come and give it a go. Now, I'm not a big guy, so it caught me a little bit by surprise that no one wanted to volunteer. In the end, the master of ceremonies, who was a local police officer, was shamed into volunteering. He was bigger than me, weighing in somewhere around 110 kilograms by my estimation. At the time, I weighed well under 80 kilograms. So I adopted a long braced stance, like our traditional Deng Sengbu stance. And I got him to try to push against one of my hands as hard as he could, to try to destabilize me or push me up. He likewise went into a long stance. He braced himself against me and he started heaving and pushing against my hand with both of his hands, but without any effect. As he was pushing, I slowly started to stand upright in my stance until I was standing bolt upright, facing him with my feet about a foot width apart. Note that in this demonstration, I wasn't leaning into his force in order to compensate externally for the incoming force. Instead, I was compensating internally by shunting the incoming forces safely through my structure without becoming destabilized. While I was shifting in this way, we explained that in our system, there is a progression from external structural stabilization through to the internal compensation that I was having to use in order to resist his pushing when I was standing in a high stance. The internal compensation is very important in terms of stability and the application of force. Without a stable foundation, it's very difficult to exert force or energy, for instance, in a punch or a kick against an opponent. At this stage, he was red in the face, he was puffing and sweating a little, and I was perfectly fine. And that was the end of the demonstration. Well, this got the crowd a little bit more excited, and we ended to a round of applause. There were quite a few people who came and spoke with us after that. One of them, another booth holder who was promoting his acupuncture business, said to me privately that he could see that I had to use Qi to do what I did, which was nice of him to say. However, two large police officers came over to our booth shortly afterwards to chat briefly. Now, one of them was clearly a bit confused and bursting to say something, said that what I did up on stage was an interesting approach to dealing with a direct attack. He had obviously missed the point of my demonstration, because that was not what I was demonstrating. He ended his conversation with a single question: why Kung Fu? Well, I was caught a bit off guard, and I was surprised by the question because I thought it was fairly obvious from my demonstration. So I mumbled something that I can no longer remember, and he moved on, never to be seen by me again. I regret not answering that question properly, although I believe that my actions on stage spoke louder than my words ever could, because despite the fact that the police officer who came to speak to me was an experienced martial artist in his own right, he could not replicate what I had done on stage. So why Kung Fu? Well, there are actually a number of reasons in my case. I love the culture and I love the history of the art. I love the philosophy and the system of thought that it represents. I love the fighting methodology and techniques. I love its effectiveness and pragmatism. I love the emphasis placed on control, respect, and the other martial virtues that's often lacking, unfortunately, from more modern martial arts. I also love the contemplation and meditation. I love the routine of practicing forms that are in some cases over 1,000 years old. To me, it's a bit like cultivating a little Zen garden in the chaos of life, or exploring a long forgotten ancient temple. I love the constant striving for improvement, mastery, transcendence. I love the aspiration to achieve Kung Fu of Wushu. But most of all, I'm blown away by its advanced biomechanics. As an engineer, this is something that fascinates me. Before we go any further, we have to ask the question, so what makes an effective fighter? This is a complex question that's actually very contextual, so it really does depend on the context within which a fighter operates. And I'd like to deal with it in more detail in a dedicated video sometime. But for the sake of this video, there are two overarching categories that can be mentioned here. A fighter's effectiveness is made up of their actual fighting skill and also their physical and mental characteristics. A fighter's actual fighting skill is like their raw skill at fighting and includes effective use of techniques, offensive and defensive tactics, familiarity with fighting, use of weapons, use of various ranges, sensitivity and knowledge of various types of opponents, and appropriate strategies. Whereas a fighter's characteristics include both mental and physical characteristics such as strength, striking power, speed, toughness, agility, mental acuity, physical endurance, determination, cunning, mental processing speed, and mental and physical control. Both of these aspects can be trained, or both of these categories can be trained, and both are important. As an example, a really strong person who has no real fighting skill at all would not necessarily do well against a skilled fighter who is weaker than they are. Likewise, an extremely skilled and cunning fighter who is unable to strike with any real power may struggle against stronger, tougher, and more numerous opponents who are not as skilled at fighting as they are. It's difficult to differentiate training methods for these two categories because what you often find is that in many training exercises, they will in fact improve aspects of both categories. However, when we talk about biomechanics, although it can certainly form part of a fighter's raw fighting skill and can be used tactically and strategically, as it is in our system and many others, it can most often be said to improve a fighter's physical characteristics. Through enhanced biomechanics, a fighter can potentially become stronger, faster, tougher, more efficient than they would be without it. When I talk about biomechanics, what I'm really talking about is a mastery of the various systems of the body, such as the external, conventional biomechanical system of muscles and bones and tendons, and the internal biomechanical system of fluid-filled spaces and internal organs. In our system of Kung Fu, conscious and subconscious parts of the human mind are also incorporated into the system of biomechanics, because the distinction or the separation between mind and body is not as definite as some people would believe. Most traditional martial arts have been practiced for hundreds or thousands of years and have been refined by their practitioners over that time. Most of the traditional systems have been used extensively in one form or another in various wars and in self-defense. So despite the bad rap that traditional martial arts often receives of late from some proponents of modern combat sports, many of these traditional arts have been tried and tested in real situations that include various wars, while some of the more modern systems have not been effectively trialed outside of the limited context of a competitive sport arena. This type of trial and error experimental refinement that form part of most traditional martial arts, under the pressure of the violent times in which they were practiced, has led to some incredible evolution in terms of the biomechanics of these martial arts. In addition, the Eastern culture, the religions, and the philosophies surrounding the development of traditional martial arts encourage the search for optimization, improvement, growth, flexibility, efficiency, balance, and transcendence. I'm talking a lot about the advanced biomechanics of traditional martial arts, but do I have anything more definite and concrete to convince and more convincing than stories and anecdotal accounts? Well, in fact, I do. There are actually a great number of studies that have been conducted on various aspects of traditional martial arts practice that prove that practitioners are capable of amazing feats of physical and mental power. Now, I'm not going to describe all of them here today. There just isn't time, and it's outside of the scope of this video. But I'll be displaying some screenshots of some of these studies. One study in particular that I will mention, which is very close to home, is the Wushu scientists' recently completed study showing that practitioners of our system of martial arts are capable of producing and resisting significantly more force in a particular set of exercises than an equally fit control group who do not train in our system. In addition, what is most interesting is that our students are producing and resisting force in a very different way, harnessing internal pressure in the intra-abdominal and pelvic cavities to amplify what they can do externally. I'll talk more about that in future videos. There's very real and scientifically verifiable evidence suggesting that traditional martial arts practitioners can utilize various forms of enhanced biomechanics to improve their performance. So why is that important? Over the last few decades, traditional martial arts have been heavily criticized by proponents of modern combat sports, despite the fact that many of these modern sports fighting systems are actually themselves founded on techniques, or at least the practitioners who and the combat sports people who participate have many of their techniques founded on techniques and approaches that were developed in the very traditional martial arts systems that they criticize. Some of the criticism leveled at certain traditional martial arts practitioners and schools may arguably be justified, and comes as a result of traditional martial artists who have overinflated egos, bogus credentials, and who lack the true skill, experience, and level of training to back these claims up. A part-time traditional martial arts practitioner, a hobbyist if you like, training a few hours a week, even with a career that may span 3 or more decades, will most likely fail in combat against a professional combat athlete who trains 30 to 40 hours a week due to lack of training and fighting experience. We've seen this repeated a number of times recently in staged bouts between self-proclaimed Kung Fu experts and professional fighters in China. Training matters. In my experience in martial arts, there's often an inverse relationship between a person's actual fighting competence and the size of their boastful claims and bravado. I'll refer you to the inverse Bullshido graph for further information on this complex relationship. As they say, empty vessels often make the most noise. However, all that said, some of the criticism aimed at traditional martial arts in general is not justified and seems to grow out of ignorance of the purpose of some of the traditional martial arts training approaches. Some of the criticism directed at traditional martial arts is aimed at the inordinate amount of time that is spent perfecting stances, basic movement, basic technique, meditation, breathing exercises, form work, katas, and the like. Some of the claims that I've seen state that these training methods are obsolete, ineffective, and are a waste of time. And yet, these are all methods of developing the advanced knowledge of biomechanics that I mentioned earlier. And yes, indeed, developing this knowledge of biomechanics certainly does take a considerable amount of time, dedication, and effort. So is it all a waste of time? My answer to that is that it depends on whether you are genetically gifted or not. Modern conventional combat sports are very popular, typically generate very large amounts of money and have enormous advertising budgets. This is very unlike traditional martial arts systems and schools which do not generate anywhere near the amount of money and hype. As such, modern combat sports have attracted a lot of attention from combat athletes wanting to make a name for themselves and perhaps a career of the sport. By far, the greater majority of people who try to make a career of professional fighting are doomed to obscurity and never really make it. The combat athletes who rise to positions of prominence in the sport, in a process very similar to natural selection, represent the best of the best. They are what could be called natural-born fighters. They're very high-level athletes indeed. Their genetics are typically superior, as is the case with most professional athletes, and they are thus typically better at their chosen sport than a normal person in just about every way. And if you think that it's unfair that some people are born with a royal flush and others get dealt a bum hand, I'll tell you what I tell my students early in their career. Life isn't fair. Get over it, deal with it, and move on. Genetically, these natural-born fighters are stronger, faster, fitter, tougher, more stable, more agile, with loads of natural fighting instinct, and thus are more competent than a typical person would ever be, even with a lifetime of following the same kind of conventional training program that these genetically superior people follow. This is another reason that old mate who trains Kung Fu twice a week at the local PCYC doesn't stand much of a chance against one of these machines. They are just born fighters and old mate isn't. So an interesting pair of related questions become apparent in this regard. If the top level fighters who compete in modern combat sports typically represent genetically superior people, how much of the success demonstrated by their particular fighting approach is due to the technical superiority of the system that they practice, and how much is due to them just being natural-born fighters? And the second question is related to the first, which is, if the performance of these natural-born fighters is heavily dependent on their natural genetics and talent, how useful would these respective fighting approaches be when practiced by a normal person? But a full discussion of these questions is out of the scope of this video as well. If there is interest, perhaps I will discuss them in a follow-up video. Let me know if you want me to address this in more detail. Would a natural combat athlete benefit from a knowledge of the advanced biomechanics present in traditional martial arts? Yes, of course, without a doubt. But typically, they do not make good students because they are impulsive, impatient, lean too heavily on their natural talents, and do not see the relevance of starting from scratch with the basics. Typically. Not in all cases, but typically. Typically, they just want to get out there and do what comes naturally to them. Most things come easily for them in their chosen sport because of their natural advantages, and so in their case, the time and effort that is required to master the complex biomechanics in traditional martial arts is just a waste of their time that they could otherwise be spending doing what they love doing, the winning competitions. However, this is a different story for a normal individual. You see, as I've already implied, a normal person could spend their entire lives training in the often unsustainable conventional training programs that these naturals train in, and yet they will never even come close to the level of effectiveness that naturals achieve because they don't have the natural gifts, genetics, inclinations, and talents that are required to make themselves as effective as a natural. I mentioned unsustainability, and it's important to acknowledge the health risks and long-term injuries that are often plague even the tough natural-born fighters after their careers have ended, let alone an average Joe or Joanna pursuing the same type of training. So the options are pretty limited for your average Joe or Joanna. The first option is to train using conventional training methods and simultaneously consign yourself to the fact that you will never be able to perform at the level that a natural-born fighter can perform at, and hope that you never have to compete against one in the case of competitive fighting, or defend yourself against one in the case of self-defense-based fighting. Because if you do, your situation is next to hopeless. The second option is to try another approach to training, one that offers superior biomechanics at a cost. And the cost is time and effort. One that can possibly improve your performance to the point where you may be able to successfully outfight a natural-born fighter or fighters due to your biomechanically enhanced performance. I'll take myself as an example. While I do have some genetic advantages in some regards, as most people do, I also have serious disadvantages. When I was quite young, I started getting interested in martial arts and physical and mental training as a way of improving myself. I started training regularly, and this has become a habit that has carried on now for over 30 years and has finally led me to where I am now. My level of competence is now vastly superior to an average person of the same sex, build, and age as myself. But it is almost entirely as a result of the training that I have done and has very little to do with any genetic advantages or disadvantages that I have. However, there are still certain things that I will never be particularly good at, like acrobatic movement, for instance. Fortunately for me, and contrary to the prevailing public opinion that is heavily grounded in Hollywood myth, the ability to do somersaults and other acrobatic tricks is not necessary in order to be a good fighter. While acrobatic tricks could potentially be an advantage in combat, if understood in that context and leveraged well, they are not a prerequisite, nor are they particularly important. I can do what my system requires of me in regards to acrobatic movement due to effort and training on my part, but I am not a natural. I started off on my training career following a very conventional set of training methods. and found that I hit the ceiling pretty fast and could not move much past it because I wasn't a natural. There was no path for me, a path to excellence. So I looked for something that could offer a different path. One that would ultimately give me a better chance, with a lot of time, dedication, and hard work, of successfully being able to beat a natural-born fighter. So that's my answer to the question, why Kung Fu? But this can equally well be applied to any one of a number of traditional martial arts systems that are serious and contain the secrets of enhanced biomechanical performance. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or you want me to address anything in more detail, leave a comment down below. Be nice in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.